Okay, great. I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm Executive Director of Hyperledger, which is a collaborative project hosted by the Linux Foundation.
Okay, and what is Hyperledger? I mean, anyone who's had any kind of interaction with certain technologies might have a rough idea, but what would you describe Hyperledger as?
So there's this exciting new world of distributed ledgers and smart contracts, which is the technology that underpins some of the cryptocurrencies out there, such as Bitcoin or Ethereum. But there's a lot of different approaches to it. It's kind of like a hybrid of a database and a peer-to-peer network that is pretty new. It's pretty novel. It's something we haven't seen before, and it's a way to build systems of record, meaning the core transaction log for a network of participants in a way that is immutable, that a way has validation logic, in a way that allows you to embed governance principles directly into code and is applicable to everything from land titles and refugee identities to core banking systems to a lot of how economies and industries work. So at Hyperledger, what we're doing is building the building blocks for those kinds of networks. The different approaches to building such a distributed ledger, because there's different ways you might do it, just like differences between different kinds of databases out there. And then the smart contract languages are also programming languages and runtime environments, but they can look very different from what we've typically been working with before. So it's core building blocks for those kinds of things, as well as there's a project on identity. There's another on kind of a graphical interface for building these blockchain environments. So lots of different efforts. It's an open source project. It's an umbrella. It's all that, and it's a lot of fun.
So before we come back to the technology, I'm just interested because you sort of the Hyperledger positions itself in its messaging very much as for business. So why? I mean, firstly, well, I think I know personally why you're using those words, but I mean, what does a business need that other options don't have, and that you feel that Hyperledger is adding?
Well, I think it comes from this recognition that there are a lot of domains in the business world that have needed a distributed ledger, but haven't really needed a cryptocurrency to drive that. There's a lot of transaction networks today at the core of, say, how stocks are bought and sold, or how bonds are bought and sold, where there have been market utilities, companies such as Swift or DTCC, or industry organizations like in the healthcare space. You have a standards body like HIMSS, but you have a lot of back office kind of companies as well. But a lot of these situations where you have these hub and spoke networks, which even if they build on top of more distributed technologies like TCP/IP and DNS and those sorts of things, still at their core are about kind of the 1950s, 60s view of networking, which is that there's one rail, there's one backbone, and everybody has to plug in or plug out. And in some cases, those rails are competitive and efficient and low fee. But in other situations, you have the parties in those networks going, we'd rather prefer to figure out ways to tie directly to each other. And so in more of a peer-to-peer setting and more of a low cost setting, and as an example in the wire payments world, sometimes it takes 3 days or up to 5 days for a wire from one bank to another to clear, especially if it's crossing international boundaries. Well, that's because of a bureaucratic and paperwork-driven process that accepted that as part of the nature of working in a hub-and-spoke network. With a distributed ledger with blockchain technology, you can get immediate confirmation or within a few seconds confirmation that a certain transaction's been recorded and the counterparty risks are managed. So it started out by these business use cases, right? But once you expand from there, you start to realize that, well, to fix the mortgage industry, a lot of people say what happened in 2008 was due to a lack of transparency, due to a lack of automation. These are areas that smart contracts, distributed ledgers might have helped. Once you start to peel away at that, you realize that, well, it would have required having the land titling system stored in a distributed ledger. That record of who owns a house, who has a lease on that house, who has recorded a mortgage against a house, and then you open up this can of worms, which is, well, if we can put the people's property titles into a ledger, we can also positively affect their, some of the deep issues out there around lack of transparency in terms of who owns what, which is a big issue in the developing world, in developing markets.
I've seen this use case a lot. There's been a couple of land title, blockchain-based organizations, projects, startups, whatever, that have been especially working in the developing world, where you're starting with a slightly cleaner slate, I suppose.
So I think in much the same way that in the early days of the internet, we had a lot of examples where in even a given use case, there were positive benefits from a business perspective as well as from a social impact perspective around democratizing access to information, acknowledging that there are downsides to that as well. Fast forward 20 years to fake news, but broadly stated, democratizing access to information was both an economic good and a social good. And we're trying to focus primarily on the economic benefits that come from deploying these technologies, so that we get out there, so that we stay grounded in reality, so that the development can be funded by companies who have a real use to go and deploy this on. We're not a research project. We're not a what if, or maybe someday. Our members are actually standing up POCs and pilots and increasingly into production. And I think that'll be a big theme for us over the next year. And so it's grounded in that. But frankly, what gets a lot of us up in the morning to work on this is the recognition this could have a positive social impact as well.
Sure. So just digging into the actual the projects a little bit. So these are all individual projects, or they're kind of a toolkit, or both. If you need to use more than one, then they integrate together well. But I can see there's some here that have described with very specific use cases. But then if you have a sort of more general project or use case, then you might end up needing elements of a couple.
It's very much a grab bag right now, and these projects are still fairly early in their life cycle. Fabric and Sawtooth and Iroha are three independent approaches to building a distributed ledger and approaching the question of how to do smart contracts or automated types of functions on top of that distributed ledger. All three of them are on a glide path to a 1.0 release sometime in the next few months, independently, of course, but just they happen to all be maturing at roughly the same pace. They have different sized communities around them, different ambitions and scale, but you could think of them as comparable to the Linux kernel, the FreeBSD kernel, and maybe an embedded RTOS kind of kernel, right? In that, they kind of perform this operating system kind of function. Now, we created Hyperledger with this view that the world was kind of unsettled out there around the best way to build these kinds of systems. That it may be something that looks more ACID compliant like MySQL, or it may be something that looks more NoSQL like, and more distributed and more, eventual consistency like Cassandra is, right? So because of that, we've said, let's be a home for a portfolio of projects, some of which could be competitive with each other, some of which may have overlapping functionality. And let's bring them in. Let's give them the same open source license. So everything's under the Apache 2.0 license. Let's use the same community dynamic for development. So all code is written in the public. All the decisions are made in public. If you are a 15-year-old in Romania, or you're a big company based in the States, a developer working for a big company in the States, you have equal chance, equal ability to become a core maintainer on any one of these projects, right? So this kind of radical openness, radical transparency is essential to making an open source project work, and making sure that every one of these projects has that same, characteristic is what's going on here. Our premise is that if we do that, and if we build Hyperledger as a community of these communities, then the natural cycle of kind of Cambrian explosion of lots of different ideas, and then an eventual whittling down of the ones that are truly distinctive and truly winning, can happen within the Hyperledger microcosm. And simply it gets a lot easier. If everything's under the same license, everything's a part of the same community, for code to be combined, for good ideas to make it from one solution to another, and then for that whittling down, or that, or maybe it's specialization. Maybe all the projects stay alive, but they specialize in different domains. But this is a process that has to take place over time. Right now, we do leave it up as an exercise to the reader to figure out when to use one or the other, but we're getting better. And there are some projects that are very distinctive. So for example, Hyperledger Indy is an identity framework. If you want to build something that looks like a national ID system, or something that looks like a decentralized replacement for login with Facebook or that sort of thing, you want to start there. And likewise, if you are partial to the Ethereum technology stack, Hyperledger Burrow is an implementation of the EVM, which is the runtime, the smart contract runtime there, which we think is the most interesting part of the Ethereum stack. And so it doesn't have to be one versus the other. Hopefully these things are combinable in the future.
Sure. Let's actually just dig into this a little bit, because this was kind of going to be my next two questions, but I think now we can tie them together. Is first, where does Hyperledger fit into the kind of timeline of the blockchain related technologies? Where did you kind of come in the removing blockchain from just being about one particular technology that we all know very well? And secondly, how does some of the projects you have under the Hyperledger umbrella compare to, and this is a busy space at the moment, there's a lot of people creating projects that do similar things. You've already mentioned Ethereum, and I've encountered various people making kind of blockchain-based databases and blockchain-based identity projects, and some come and go very quickly and some stick around. And so sort of how do you see where you fit into the whole kind of ecosystem at the moment?
Well, think of it as the role that Apache played in the web. I mean, it started out, right, that people knew of Apache because of the HTTP server that carried that name. But from 98, 99 onward, Apache became a home for a lot of different technologies that were related to building websites, building big systems, right? Eventually, it also came to include big data and things like open office and other things. But it wasn't just about a single monolithic web server. It was about running Java behind that, running PHP behind that, running Python behind that, all sorts of development frameworks. And in the web community, we had some standards like HTTP and HTML, which themselves also were under constant churn, but there was never a need to converge on just one server-side programming language, right? Or just one, even just one data format, right? So think of Hyperledger similarly, right? There's and another way that I've characterized it, right, is a lot of what's going on in the blockchain industry, because it's so young, is could be classified into three different buckets that you can look to the way the domain name system evolved, right, as for comparison. So one of those buckets is standards development, and that's similar to what like the IETF does or ISO or others. Right now in the blockchain industry, you kind of have what the Bitcoin developers do and decide to do, what the Ethereum developers decide to do, but it's fairly chaotic out there, right? And while it's starting to converge, I was really glad to see the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance emerge, because they are positioning themselves as a standards organization to try to standardize some of the enterprise side of those technologies. Most of the time, the people are fairly weak there, and we'll see. I think the W3C and IETF, start to have a role here, but we're not a standards body. You also see governance organizations out there that perform the same kind of role that, say, ICANN performs in the domain name system, right? where it's about governance of a namespace, governance of a running collection of systems. And so you could think of the Ethereum community and the relationship between developers and the miners in the Ethereum community as kind of a governance model, right? Or the Bitcoin community and the way that they manage. And largely that's about managing their crypto tokens, right? The faith and credibility in the BTC token, in the ETH token, and other things. So that's also something we don't do. You're never going to see a hypercoin. You're never going to see us promote one specific network. We're building blocks for people to go off and build their own networks, largely on the premise. And I'd say we were very heretical about this when we first emerged, and I think it's become more accepted that there will be lots and lots of these private networks, private blockchain networks that will tie together in some interesting ways. And ideally, they're all running from a small pool of similar software underneath them, so it's easy to stand up instances on these chains and have them talk to each other. But we're not about converging everybody on one global transaction rail, right? Or one global transaction network. What we are about is code, about building implementations. And so, focused on getting developers together to productively evolve, these different projects together and make sure that every one of these projects is multi-stakeholder. So that, in the long term, when you look at Fabric, you don't have to worry what's Fabric's future if one or more companies decide to stop working on Fabric, stop developing Fabric, or more importantly, is Fabric just the product of one company's developers, one company's vision about how to do things? No, the answer is even today with Fabric, and this is a focus for us for all of our other projects, grow it beyond an initial contributor, grow it beyond any single vendor to make it really clear it's a multi-stakeholder project. And so I think those two things, the fact we're about implementations and not about governance or standards, and then secondarily that we're about ensuring that these projects outlive their original contributors, outlive and are more solid than any one particular vendor. Those are two things that distinguish us from anybody else out there.
There's two things you said that I'd like to dig into a bit more. I'll just start first with the where you sort of ended. When you're talking about going beyond individual contributors or individual contributing companies, I mean, this is obviously a very wise thing to do in the open source world. But just out of interest, these various projects, do they all kind of form out of the same collection of people, or were they individual projects created by different people that sort of came together slowly or relatively slowly?
Yeah. Almost every one of our projects came from a different source. I think the only true overlap is that Composer and Cello both also started life as kind of internal IBM projects, and IBM did contribute Fabric initially, and the other projects have all come from other sources. Sawtooth came initially from Intel. Burrow originally came from a company called Monax, which used to be called Eris Industries.
Oh, no, I know them. I interviewed them a long time ago. Yeah.
So Eris Industries are involved there. And then Iroha came from a startup in Japan called Soramitsu, who have a real thriving business around this now. So these technologies come from different places. Oh, and finally, Project Indie actually comes to us from another nonprofit called the Sovereign Foundation, which is establishing itself more like an ICANN-style governance kind of organization around a global distributed identity network. And so there, the comparison to, we're the implementers, they're the governance, they're the ICANN, is much sharper relief. But these are all just original contributions, and we try very hard to make it clear that, okay, well, that's appreciated. We presume that that's not the end of the story, that that's the beginning of the story, right? And so we expect those companies, and they have been, to continue to be evolved. But it also has to be clearly open now for others to come in and build their businesses on top of. And so we resist the notion that, these projects have any, primary association with a given vendor, on day two, right? It's not Intel's Sawtooth. It's not Monax's Burrow. It is Hyperledger. Hyperledger Burrow. It's Hyperledger Sawtooth, and also we need to substantiate that and materialize it in the form of getting other developers to show up, making sure the world knows what's distinctive about these projects. And finally, I'll say our goal is not to be the GitHub of blockchain technologies. We want to cultivate a pretty rich, diverse portfolio of these different projects.
I think I'm actually I interviewed last week someone from Cloud Foundry, and it almost feels a bit more like down that path, kind of this collection of recommended modules that you can build your business on and add your own customizations to if you so wish, but that shared origin story at least kind of guarantees a certain commonality amongst them all.
Well, and we do a lot as well to, we have a lot of cross-cutting working groups and initiatives to try to, at the very least, standardize terminology. What does a transaction mean? What does a global system log mean? I mean, if we can at least do that, we can help people compare, apples to oranges and not apples to elephants, right?
Yeah.
But going forward, there's common approaches to things like security, to identity, to how do we measure performance and scalability. So we have working groups on all of those that are cross-cutting, that involve developers from each of those projects, that, and try to maintain a steady heartbeat of, addressing, helping the world understand how these are related to each other, right? And different from each other, and they'll differ more over time. I use the metaphor of Darwin's finches on Galapagos Island, where they all develop separate beak shapes to go and get different prey. So at some point, our finches will have different beaks, I promise.
Well, I'd actually like to again. A couple of questions ago, you started going into an area that I wanted to cover, which was this. So you mentioned a few, like IBM especially in there. Intel, I haven't seen so much in the blockchain space, but I guess they're involved. And there's a lot of kind of not just technology companies, or actually not technology companies that you would immediately think of also getting involved in blockchain. So I've actually seen efforts from Bosch. And lots of the kind of logistics companies now making IoT hardware. There's a lot of great, fantastic use cases for blockchains, which means that lots of people are getting on board with it. But the criticism from the traditional community has often been that they're going to end up creating a lot of these kind of private blockchains, which defeated the purpose in the first place. And then some people also say that, well, they're public within the people who have access to them, so it's okay. There's a lot of sort of discussion around this. But is part of your intention to at least help some of these very enthusiastic corporates use some of the same tooling? So at least if they do want to have that interoperability in the future, it's possible instead of creating their own technologies.
Well, it was pretty clear to me even before I jumped fully into this that not everyone was going to jump on the Bitcoin train or needed to jump on the Ethereum train from a governance perspective and record transactions in a public ledger. I mean, for the same reason why it's a really good idea that your refrigerator doesn't have a public IP address. Right.
Well, some of them will do soon, I think. But
and some of them have been used in botnets regardless. But it's a really good security comes in layers, right? And there's one layer of security that would come from building, a private system of record with encrypted data, even on top of a public chain. But there's so many more advantages from transaction costs to transaction flow to simple security, to be able to say, I've got a set of use cases here that require, to participate in my network, require signing a legal document that binds you to a human governance model, right, that governs the sharing of data on this chain and what you're allowed to do on the chain. And that, that doesn't mean that you never build apps that talk to the public chains at the same time. In fact, there's at least one really good use case for publishing checksums to the public chain of the state of the private chain, so that you can always go back with high integrity and argue that, an older transaction, actually did happen on a certain date at a certain time. And that the integrity of the entire chain is consistent up to that point. There's a lot of reasons why private systems of record are the rule today, and why there's governance models around the participants in those networks. And we can debate how open those borders are. There's nothing in this that says you can't have a private network of thousands of participants, or even a network where the ability to write is permissioned, but the ability to read is unpermissioned. If you think about it, the global domain name system is a permissioned write system. There's only a couple of hundred different domain name registrars who have the authority because they signed I forget what the name of that document is, but basically the agreement for how to manage trademark issues and IP issues in the domain name space. Those are the couple hundred entities allowed to add a new .com or a new .org, or set up a new TLD, right? So governance models are the way that society works. And it's an extremist view to say that governance can only can shift to an entirely digital or entirely, algorithmic setting. So these are technologies to build private networks, and just like Linux, is used all over the cloud, even for private websites. This is supportive technology for being able to do this, whether you're building private networks or for some of these things, they may be suitable for entirely public right kind of networks too. We'll find out over time.
You actually put it very succinctly. I mean, it's I suppose the issue with a lot of these kind of, especially the very open, democratic, in inverted commas, technologies that often emerge from very idealistic positions, and often that gets filtered after a while. Yeah. But the comparison you make to Linux is a very good example. I actually spent a lot of my time with open source software, and in the past I used to contribute to an open source CRM tool that was mostly aimed at non-profits. And of course we often discovered that it was being used by non-profits whose opinions we didn't completely agree with, but that's how it works. That's just what you expect is going to happen. So yeah. I've got one kind of tangential question I'd like to ask. Okay. But before I do that,
I do think we only scheduled 30 because I think I've got I've got another call waiting for me. So
okay,
one more question.
Okay, I'll stick to the tangential question then. Actually, maybe I'll stick to the non-tangential question, because otherwise it could go off for too long. So just a wrap-up question then would be, anything in particular that you want to make sure people know about right now? Any news, any recent news, anything coming up in the near future that you'd like people to know about?
We could certainly follow up with email and send you a couple of links of distinction. But I'm really proud of the 3 projects we've added recently: Burrow, Indie, and Composer, because these speak to 3 really important questions out there. How do we relate to the evolving public chain technology landscape? So that's Burrow with its implementation of the Ethereum VM. Hyperledger Indie relates to this really serious question about how are we going to use blockchains to store PII, especially in light of things like the GDPR coming into effect next year in Europe, which will affect every business globally. And then Composer, which is how do we make all this technology more accessible to the wider developer community, right? And so this is hopefully a taste of the kind of projects we'll have going forward as well. But this is an expansion that we're managing carefully, and we're excited about all 3 of these different projects.
It was amazing to talk to you. I could have talked to you about so many other things, including past, present, and future. And actually, I should have mentioned at the very beginning, I'm actually got to dash off to a blockchain meetup here in Berlin. And I would have loved to have spoken to you about what's going on in Berlin as well, because there's a lot of blockchain-related activity. But
absolutely,
another time, maybe.
Always a chance for another.
Thanks very much for your time anyway. And excellent to talk to you. Take care.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Brian.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.